This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, folks, and welcome. Rick here from Queen's College. Pleased today to welcome those who are attending us online. We have about 50 online now, and those who are viewing this as a recording. Just delighted to be offering the session on digital ministry, and so we look forward to having great discussion amongst those who will present and those who will participate. And then as we move on through the series, we'll go deeper in a lot of the topics that we have, and it will be indeed exciting and worthwhile, I hope, for everyone. So we're going to just take a moment to remind you that it's a three-part series. On the screen in front of you are the topics. This one today is to focus on ecclesiology matters. It's looking at the more theological foundations of the discussion on digital ministry, applied theology and technology. Next week is going to be into more practical types of matters with regard to the use of technology, the technical pieces, as well as the using them as tools and techniques, we might say, to enhance ministry, and when and how is it appropriate to do that. And the third session will be on personal and professional wellness. We have panelists invited for each of the sessions. The third session, I have Kurt Hillier, a psychologist, recruited to participate with us. We are getting a little bit of feedback, so if your microphone is on, please turn it off, because it's likely the cause of the feedback. If your camera is on and you weren't presenting in the session, then please turn it off as well. So today our panelists are going to be Bishop Jeff, Dr. Carmel Doyle, Reverend Keith Denman, Rob Cook, and Reverend Canon Paulette Ogden. And so I'm going to pass it right to Keith now to lead us into the first session, and I'm going to go through the list and turn off microphones on those who have them on.
There we go. I think I'm turned on. Just have to find my right paper. There we go. All right, welcome. Thank you for this chance to be part of this. A small group of people sit inside. They don't want to be there, but they don't have much choice. Something unexpected and terrible has happened. The world they thought they lived in had changed in ways that they didn't want and don't like. They're trying to figure out whether they can or how they should return to the life as it used to be. They know they've been called to move out into the world, but they have no idea how to do that. They want to do the thing they believe God has called them to do, but they're stuck. Most of them have lots of skills and life experiences, but that doesn't really help them in the situation they're in. They've grown up within a religious tradition and a set of practices that doesn't apply to the world into which they're called. It's partly about the actual language, the technology, if you will, but also the ideas, the conceptual framework in which the people around them view the world. They've been asked to bring a message of creation and kingdom, of sin and redemption, of justice and reconciliation, of covenant and jubilee, to a people in a culture that have no idea what these words mean to the people asked to speak to them. Where do we even begin? How do we sing the Lord's song in this strange land? A reading from the Acts of the Apostles, familiar to all of us, I'm pretty sure. When they had come together, they asked him, "When, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?" Jesus replied, "It's not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority, but you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. Then suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language?" We sit, many of us, in empty, closed churches. If we're honest, we'll admit that in many parishes, the difference between before and after COVID is not that dramatic. The buildings haven't been full for many years, even on Christmas. A lot of us struggle to understand what to say that will be meaningful to a generation who spend their time with faces buried in their iPhones, who can have any pieces of information in the world in seconds, who view us as service providers more than communities, who use the same words we do but mean very different things, whose refreshingly keen sense of injustice and hypocrisy, when aimed at us, makes some of us want to lash back at these young whippersnappers rather than celebrate the passion and commitment it shows. And here we sit, trying to figure out which button sends our image out to the people we hope are watching online, hoping that they will see more than just our poorly trimmed nose hairs and the cat stays out of sight. We piece together services from books that are meant for use in gatherings, sing music meant for crowds of people with trained organists, preach to an empty space or maybe one or two people running the camera and helping with the service. And we wonder if it's doing anything even remotely like what we're called to do by God. Is it? Are we being faithful or desperately hanging on until the people are allowed back in? The strong maybe is the best I can come up with. The church has been through wrenching changes in its past, and it's still here. How it works and what it thinks it's doing in answering God's call have changed dramatically before and will very likely change again. Some of us are doing things that are well received and have a lot of people watching. Some of us feel we're preaching to a void. In some cases, it's probably true. Numbers don't tell us if we're making a difference in people's lives, and slick, entertaining services may be more enjoyable, but that may not be what people need to see. It is true that if no one is hearing the good news in what we're doing, it isn't working. No matter how excruciatingly correct our theology is, or how dazzling our use of Zoom backgrounds and PowerPoints, well, it's just not working. The good news, though, is that we're not left to figure this out all by ourselves. We need to do our homework. We need to learn all we can about the tools at our disposal. We need to learn all we can about what issues, fears, and joys are on the hearts and minds of the people we're trying to speak to. And we need to be open to doing things in ways that we haven't before, and maybe even some ways we don't like. We have to be prepared to look kind of stupid sometimes as we try out technology and approaches to the gospel that are uncomfortable. But if we're open to God's guidance and the empowerment and leading of the Holy Spirit, like that group of disciples gathered in fear, waiting in Jerusalem for something to happen, we'll be able to get through this and emerge on the other side in whatever world we emerge into with hope and joy and faith, and the assurance that God is with us in the parts we like and with us in the parts we don't. We can do this. When they had come together, they asked him, "Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?" Jesus replied, "It is not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Thank you. So my points to ponder, I'm not quite sure the transition process here. What in the current situation in which we find ourselves, what languages do we need to maintain? What languages do we need to discard, and what languages do we need to learn? And I hand it off to whoever's next. Carmel, I think, is it?
Thank you, Keith. As Keith was saying, times are changing. Rick, if you could. Okay. The church was closed in many, many ways long before COVID-19. Many, many things have happened in our history that have caused others, if not caused ourselves, to question who we are and what we're doing. Many, many times we've struggled long and hard to keep what we thought we were doing and tried as hard as we could in the ways we knew to reinforce that and keep that alive. This has happened before in our history, our long history. Okay, Rick? From the beginning, there have been different ways to go about the task that we're called to. In the New Testament itself, we see certainly two different models. The Jesus model is one, in which if you just take, I'm not going to read these descriptors, but his was a very vital, moving, living, constantly changing, adapting to who showed up model. Then when Paul came along, things began to change because the world had changed. Paul went to a different world. He left the world of Judaism and Jerusalem and moved out into a bigger, broader world in which these people to whom he was speaking were not just minorities, they were exceptional, strange little groups in the middle of a world that didn't quite know what to do with them or how to describe them. And again, if you take a look at what you see there, you're seeing in part some of the effects of the Roman Empire that wasn't quite yet in officially, but because Paul was a Roman citizen and he understood the way the world worked that he was traveling in, he took bits and pieces from that world and began to use those as the mechanism whereby the good news was able to be passed on. Avery Dulles in the 1970s wrote a book called Models of the Church, in which he looked at other ways that we as church have tried to say who we are and what we do. And depending upon how we see ourselves, what we do will change. So it's a matter of form and function. If we see ourselves in one particular way, our function, what we do, our form or our model all around us will indicate that. And the models he initially identified were the first five there as institution, mystical communion, sacrament, herald, and servant. Later on in the 80s and 90s, he added a sixth model, and that is of the community of disciples. And each of these has their own theology, their own language, their own rituals and rites. So we'll take just a quick look at the first one. And the question throughout all of this is, how much of this are we still seeing today? How do we see ourselves and how does our function follow from that? The first one, an institution. This is when the Roman model really did take over the whole reality of that unifying force in a vast and diverse world. And in that world, in the institutional world, the emphasis was on clarity of identity, the different practices and procedures, as well as governance. So we could call it all together and have it all able to work in the same way, more or less in different places. The second was that of mystical communion. After a while, when the Roman Empire crumbled, and that whole need to stay together was kind of meaningless in a world that was totally separate, the church focused on the notion of we are a communion of believers. We are a mystical communion. We may not be united in any other way, but we're united in a shared faith. And here the emphasis is on unity of community in God and on holiness. often personal holiness. Some of those elements remain to this day, just as some of the first elements of the institution remain to this day. The next one, please. The next one is the idea of church as sacrament. More than anything else, when we believe the gospel has been spread to the ends of the earth and we've given the message, so then what do? Well, very often we then practice or focus a lot on the internal life of the church itself and how it reaches out through particular moments in people's lives. So the church as sign, sacrament, and an instrument in the world of the believers, not in the others, but in the believers. The emphasis on teaching to understand the signs and symbols, the seen and the unseen. And that has taken different forms and formats through the years, and we're still in that process of transforming how we do these holy actions that signify the reality of our life in God together. Then when exploration began to be a big piece, going out to those places that had not yet heard the good news, Asia, Africa, the New World, the notion became alive in the church again of we must announce the good news. We have to become a herald. And therefore, everything about us and our actions takes a focus on saying, well, what would we need if we were to be heralds, where our emphasis on the mission of announcing the good news of the kingdom. So here the word becomes important. It's also the time of the Reformation, in which there was a sense that the word hadn't really been heard in a long time. It had been swallowed up in some kind of sacramental life that was pretty mysterious to an uneducated public. So again, that notion of how do we share the word across the ages. Next one. Then the focus, given the world that we lived in particular, having had the experience of world wars that totally disrupted what we thought we knew was civilization, and needs of people became very, very clear again. The church began to see itself perhaps as a servant committed to justice, to social justice, where we saw our role as that of transforming the whole world with the justice for all, otherwise known as the kingdom of God. Next one. Then Dulles, I think, probably in a kind of understanding that previous models didn't quite capture the energy that was going to be needed if the church was to continue, because he saw the church dying first in Europe and then in North America, began to say the structures, the institutional pieces, the heralding, the serving don't seem to be sufficient for us as a people right now. We've lost the notion of being a community of learners, a community of disciples, those who follow the Lord. So he put together the notion of the church as a community of disciples that integrates others through emphasis on the church's never-ending task of following the Lord Jesus. And it's in that whole notion of opening our doors, being a community again with a focus on Jesus and the gospel that certainly does many other things that the other models did, that he believes that the church will find its strength and energy today. And so with all of that, we find that there are very often old models and new models which need to emerge. But we can't understand where it is we're going to go if we don't have some sense of why the things are there that we have and why we do them. So it's important to have a sense of what model of church we understand, hence looking at the other models, previous models, and then seeing what is needed for today. Okay, the next one. So some points to ponder. And we give you some of these questions so that as we go forward, particularly when we open it up for discussion, there may be something there that you want to explore further. So why is it important for you and your faith community to identify your working model of church as you prepare for the new normal, that the Spirit, not just COVID, but the Spirit is opening up for the church in the world? How do we identify these essentials from our past and adapt them for the future? And how can we graciously acknowledge elements that have fulfilled their purpose and in gratitude or confession, let them go as we follow the Spirit's lead into the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Carmel. I want to say a thank you to Keith as well. We slipped along from one session to the other. Most of you know, I'm sure, that Reverend Keith Denman is pastor at St. Mary's in Clarenville. And Keith, thanks for the great lead into the session this morning and the thoughts and ideas you shared with us then and later in the session as well. Carmel Doyle, Dr. Carmel Doyle, as most of you likely know, is with us here at Queen's College. She's the director of student programs and been with Queen's teaching particularly in faith development areas and pastoral studies for many years. Carmel, that was an excellent presentation. Every Dulles would be proud of you. I'm going to pass it on now to Reverend Canon Ogden, who's a pastor at Deer Lake, and Paulette is going to bring some, I suppose, pastoral experiences and questions, issues to the discussion. Thanks, Paulette, and I'll ask you to turn on your camera if you don't have it on already.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and I'm really happy to be doing this, and hopefully I'll give you a little bit of insight of how I'm sure we are all feeling, not just me. But we wonder as we sit in our offices and not in our buildings, what really has happened to our ministry, I'm sure, and what has happened to our church since the onset of the pandemic of COVID-19. I'm sure we ask ourselves that probably many times during the day and the week. Dr. Carmel just had a wonderful presentation on the models of the churches throughout the ages and how it changed and evolved. And as you all know, change has been forced upon us during the last 3 months. And change in the church normally comes very slowly, unless an event or something comes along and forces that change. And for us, one day in March, it was business as usual for the church, and the next day our buildings were closed. And not only that, we weren't permitted to visit people, to have any pastoral contact except by phone or some kind of online. We couldn't visit them in their homes or in healthcare facilities. And that wasn't just for us, that was for their family and friends also. So right now, online is basically where we all are. But of course, even in that, there are those who cannot avail of that for many reasons, one being poor internet access in a lot of places. And while we're doing online worship, I'm sure, you know, we as human beings look at, oh, look at the number of views we had, look at the number of engagements we have had. And I guess that's not really a great idea, because we might get the false idea that the worship that we're offering is this big, wonderful, transformative experience for all those watching. And that's probably not true. Some people might be just watching. Some people might actually be worshiping with us. We have no idea really, except for the people who make comments or maybe give us a phone call. But I do think that it is a good indicator that we need not to just brush aside. I think it's an indicator really that people are probably looking for something different or something to complement what we offer as clergy and lay leaders in our buildings on a Sunday or any day, something that we offer in our worship space. And throughout all this, I'm sure a lot of us are feeling like refugees with no home. Clergy and lay alike, because I've had many people say to me, I just want to get back in our building. We've been forced out of our buildings, kicked out really. And I know that makes us all fumble around trying to find a substitute, a good substitute. So in all that, sometimes we think we have to be doing what others are doing, whether we're capable of or whether we feel like we can, we kind of force ourselves to look and see what others are doing and try to do that. And we also have boundaries that we have to work inside. We're Anglicans. We're expected to worship like Anglicans. And we have to stay within government regulations, whether that be with a streaming license or whatever. So where does all that leave us as faith leaders, lay leaders, as followers of Jesus, as disciples? Well, I think one of the things is it leaves us in a place of lamenting. I'm sure there are many times when we feel like the psalmist in Psalm 22 asking, my God, why have you forsaken me? But that's not the only side to it, is it? Because as followers of Jesus, we are also people of the hope, people of the good news. And again, I look to the Psalms for a reference. Psalm 39 verse 7 says, and now, O Lord, what do I wait for? My hope is in you. So we cling to that hope because we are people of the hope, builders of the kingdom. And at this time, and hopefully the same as any time, we are rooted in prayer and scripture and the good news of the gospel. And in all that, we're trying to concentrate on what we can do and try not to be dwelling on what we cannot do, because we cannot worship in our church buildings and we cannot physically reach out to those in pain and grief. But we can still do many things. We can still donate to our food bank and give to PWRDF or the Anglican Foundation, any charity that we know would help others in this pandemic. And as faith leaders, it is important to continue to try and build up the kingdom of God, because that is what we are about, and to be there for people and to lead worship if we feel up to the challenge in different ways than we have before, and to find a way that works for us and others to be there for people pastorally. So as you see on the slide there are two things that I really think about, and I've kind of got them separated, but when I really think about it, they're really intertwined. And one is worship, and the other is pastoral situations. For me, I'm not saying that I'm doing a great job, but for me, worship seemed to be the easier of the two, because I was kind of doing a little bit of that anyway on this online stuff. But if you don't have internet access, this could be a really, really difficult, maybe the most difficult of the two. Many people are doing worship through Zoom and GoToMeeting like we are here today, Facebook Live, and YouTube and other means. And many people are tuning in, more people than we seem like we had ever reached. So that means to me that the church has got a bigger base and a bigger reach. But we really need to look at that. And now on the next slide, you will see that there are pros and cons that I've looked at, and I'm sure that you have many more, and I would really appreciate hearing about that later. But you can see we're reaching people who may not normally worship in the building and we wouldn't touch. We have more flexibility for worship times. You can record one day and post the next or earlier in the day. And it is also a possibility of more creative worship, because you can join singing in, you can join in, depending on your technical abilities, you can get very creative. And then the cons. Some people have poor internet access or none in some areas. And then you may be very limited in your technology ability. And you may not have anyone around you who can help. And then it's a financial loss of not being in your buildings, because most people, if they're clicking online, they're probably not sending along money. And we need money to operate. That's reality. And then is the interaction with people, which is really a big one for me. Because as an extrovert, I miss the energy of other people, like I'm sure many of you do. But the most difficult in this for me, and this is my experience that I'm relating to you today, and we'll look at the next slide now. I have a couple of examples for you, a couple of little stories, and I won't give too many details because of confidentiality. But I had a young woman who had young children pass away. And it was a very difficult situation because not being able to pastorally visit and that. But then a couple of days after her funeral, her mother got really sick and has much the same illness that her daughter had. So not good. I think I got muted for a minute there. Then the president of my ACW died without warning. So her husband was left to grieve alone because the children were away and couldn't come home to have a funeral or to help grieve together. So these are just a few examples of pastoral situations where I would normally be present to people, physically present to people. So because of this, I've been asking myself some questions. And you see them here. Do I need to be physical present to help show them the love of God surrounds them? Is it necessary for me to be there? I'm sure, as you all know, God is always present. Is it necessary for me to be in the room with them to pray? Or does the phone call or video call accomplish the same thing? And I've had experience with both. What does being present really mean? Do we have to be physically present to be present with people? And I'm sure these are things you've asked in yourselves. Do they see and feel the presence of God in their situation when I'm not there? And that's like it puts a big load on who we are. But that's not really what I meant, because sometimes people need that physical presence to help them open themselves to that presence of God. Not always, but sometimes. I've had many times that I've had the prayers over the phone for grief and illness. But I ask myself, is this just a stopgap measure for now? Or is it a genuine presence? I know I've talked to people who feel very short taken because I can't come and visit. And others just so thankful that they can speak on the phone. I think there have been many benefits to the changes that we've had to make, but there's also been very many sacrifices and losses. So when we return to normal or a new normal, I feel that we have to keep an eye on what we've gained and what we've lost. And just to make sure that we don't lose anything that we've gained. When we reflect, and I'm sure there's lots of time for reflection, we realize that out of any death, there always comes new life and new shoots. So it's time for some theological reflection as we change and maybe get back in our buildings and maybe can visit again. The death and resurrection of Jesus, I think, are the best examples of what God does with the worst of times. From the darkest moment of the death of Jesus to the glorious moment when people realized that Jesus was still with them, still among them, still alive. And I've got a beautiful, kind of a happier story to kind of clue up with. And it's in one of our parishes in the Western Diocese. A lady called her priest to thank her for bringing her daughter back to church. Now you may be asking, how did she get back to church in this situation? Well, her daughter used to go to church with her. And for the last few years, she hasn't. But along came this pandemic and this digital age. and her daughter brings her iPad to her mother so they can watch worship together. So this mother now feels like her daughter is back to church with her. And there's no way she feels that this would have happened without the pandemic. So a little positive. So I leave you with this story and the questions on the next slide to ponder and discuss. How do we hold on to what we consider to be the benefits? Well, these are the questions I've asked myself first, so we'll look at those. Is what we're doing now online worship and or pastoral presence through technology just stopgap measures? Are they? Or is online worship real worship, and are our pastoral efforts offering a genuine presence to people? These are questions I've asked myself. Then after hearing that story, we'll go to the next slide and the questions and points to ponder and discuss. How do we hold on to what we consider to be the benefits, like this story I just read for you? What do we need to leave behind? I think that is going to take a lot of reflecting on our part and conversation with those that we serve and those that we worship with. How do we embrace our new normal while still respecting and doing for those who want to return to the pre-COVID-19 days? Some people only want to get back in their building. That's all they want to do right now. And they can't see any further than that. So that needs conversation. What is the Spirit saying to the church? And are we listening? Here comes our prayer, our reading of Scripture, a theological reflection, and some contemplation in prayer to hear the voice of the Spirit. And where in all of this do we see resurrection? Do we see new life emerging? Again, time to be still and listen for the voice of God and to really open our eyes and the eyes of our hearts. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paulette. Wonderful sharing, reflections, stories to illustrate, and points to ponder, and a great connection back to the, I suppose, sifting we have to do on the models of church, and that's the ecclesiology, if it is so important. We're going to bring it now to Bishop Jeff. I'm sure you all know Bishop Jeff is the Bishop, Diocese of Eastern Newfoundland and Labrador. And Bishop Jeff, thanks for agreeing to be with us today and focusing us on continuing with the mission of the church, mission in general.
Okay, thank you, Rick, and thank you all for joining with us today. It's been a really difficult time for faith communities. We are heavily dependent upon being physically present to people, and we have lost that. We've tried to replace it in other ways, but I wouldn't ever think that telephones and live streaming can ever fully replace what we have lost. So we're struggling through that because of COVID-19. Also, for those of us in the Anglican tradition, there's been the loss of the sacramental life of our church. And that has been a tremendous sense of loss to a great many people, because that's been so fundamental to what we do as Anglicans. And losing that has also affected our spiritual lives in important ways. And of course, in the midst of all this, there's great social ferment around us. There's upheaval and turmoil, particularly in the United States, but not just there, everywhere these days. The death of George Floyd has been very traumatic for a great many people, and it has led to things like calls to defund the police, and so there's a lot of things happening in society that faith communities struggle to respond to, and some of us are aware that we also have been part of the wider social fabric and have not always done what we needed to do as communities of faith. What I see from my perspective is something of a paradox in faith communities today and within my church, that I think our response is to move in two directions. We're definitely moving into new places with the online streaming of services and our internet presence. We're out there now in a way that we never were before. And many of us have had to learn new tools and new skills in doing that. So we're really moving strongly in that direction. But there's a temptation to move in another direction that I call survival, that we're going to lock things down and shut things down, and we're just going to take care of ourselves. And that's driven in many cases by the financial reality. We're seeing a decline in income in many places because, of course, we've lost the gathered community and the collection plate, and that's not always going to be replaced by electronic givings. But we've lost our fundraising in faith communities. And so there is a concern over survival and what needs to continue and what may not continue in the midst of all this. That generates a lot of anxiety. And part of the anxiety I see with some people today is concern over views and counts online. I don't think that's helpful in the midst of this. The fact that you're making the effort to be present to people in this new way is good enough, and we need not be concerned. The first thing I hear too many people say is, how many views are you getting? And I think we need to not do that in our community. We need to simply give ourselves an A for effort. I have communities and congregations where there are no high-speed internet connections. I have places where there's no cell phone coverage. So you can't compare what one place is able to do with what another place might be able to do. So I think the paradox is that we're moving in two directions at once, and the online presence is certainly a good thing, but it is not going to replace all that we've lost, and we hope for the day that we can come back. And the other one is the temptation simply to focus on survival right now and take care of ourselves, hold on to as much as we can. And all of that's led to some sort of a mission confusion. I think there's been a confusion about our mission in the minds of some. A year and a half ago, we gathered through Queen's College for a course in mission and the theology of mission. And much of that course was directed toward the Missio Dei, the mission of God, that Christian mission is grounded in the wider mission of God. We as a faith community do not engage in mission for our own sakes. We are invited to share in the wider mission of God. It is God who has the mission. The church is invited to share in that greater mission. And I share with you some words from Stephen Spencer. He writes, "Mission is not the church going out and saving people. Rather, it is God creating and saving the world. And this includes not only creating and saving people, but the natural world and indeed the cosmos as a whole. It is therefore something immensely greater than the church. It is the primary fact, and the church is secondary. The mission of God came first, and the church was created as a response to that. The church is a product of mission rather than the other way around." And we need to remind ourselves of that greater mission. And that is a mission that transcends COVID-19. It transcends the social ferment around us right now. It is a mission that existed before we came along, and it's a mission that's going to carry on even when we are no longer here. So the mission of God is, for Anglicans in Canada, is sometimes focused on the marks of mission. That should be on your screen there, the 5 marks of mission that all of us are familiar with in the Anglican Church of Canada. And these, of course, call us to much more than serve the church, but to serve the world, and ultimately to serve God in all that we say and all that we do. A true missional church will minister for the sake of the world and not for its own ends. And we need to be careful that we don't focus on our own ends, even though the temptation right now during this difficult time would lead some people toward thinking about survival. Survival can never be our mission. Our mission is greater than that. And you know the old cliche, it is not the church of God that has a mission. It is the mission of God that has a church. Just take another minute or so, and I'm at Synod office right now, and just down the hall from me is our finance officer, Fred Dinham, and Fred uses the term BC and AC. And BC is before COVID, and AC is after COVID. And his work, which is important in many ways to the life of our diocese and our parishes, has been divided up now between what used to be and what is coming to be, because we are probably going to come out of this with a smaller church, a church that is going to be focused in different ways. It's going to be a church with different kinds of relationships. Some of them will be online. I don't like the word virtual when we move into digital conversations, because for me, virtual suggests something that's not real. But these relationships can be very real and very important to people. I think we're going to form new relationships, AC, after COVID. Some relationships will end. Some of the things we've been doing probably won't come back ever in quite the same way. I like to say our churches will have truly left the building because they will have a different presence in the world. And because of that, they will discover new members. We're seeing that all over the place. We've just come through Trinity Sunday and celebrated the unity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the mission of God is grounded in the Holy Trinity. It is ascending from the Holy Trinity into the world. The Father sent the Son. They in turn sent the Holy Spirit. There are some theologians who would say from that unity the Church was sent. There is ascending into the world from the Holy Trinity, and mission is grounded in that. So on Trinity Sunday, we focused on what it means to be part of a church that celebrates the Holy Trinity. And on Trinity Sunday, I was in Labrador. I preached to the Archdeaconry of Labrador. And in my Trinitarian sermon, in my sermon about Trinity Sunday and the Holy Trinity, toward the end of the sermon, this is what I said. In the centuries since Jesus walked among us, we have developed elaborate ways of thinking about his message, and sometimes made it pretty complicated. But the message of Jesus was actually pretty simple. Something about loving God with your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Jesus asked people to follow him and become learners and disciples. Christianity was a much simpler endeavor in the beginning, and I wonder if what is most needed today is a return to a humbler faith. Maybe that is what is happening to us during this time of pandemic. I have spoken of the mystery of the Holy Trinity today, but perhaps we find ourselves in the middle of another kind of mystery right now, as everything changes right before our eyes. We have lost so much of late that was familiar in life, and discovered that lots of things we thought we needed, we didn't need at all. In losing some things, we have gained other things, like time with each other, like the joy of cooking a meal together, like long days out on the land, like the peace of a simpler life. We have lost so much of late that was familiar in our church life, and in the midst of it have discovered new ways of being the church. All of the telephone calls and emails and other ways in which we are keeping in touch, and the incredible amount of live streaming that we're doing with our worship and prayers these days. have actually brought new life to the church, and I wonder what more may still be in store for us to discover. In our churches, we have had to put aside so much we thought we needed, and in the process discovered so much that we truly needed. Whether we ever understand the Holy Trinity, much less believe it, might not be nearly so important as whether we understand and believe in Jesus, for it is Jesus we truly need. On this Holy Trinity Sunday, we celebrate the mystery of the Blessed Trinity, but let us do that knowing that we are also in the midst of another kind of mystery today that continues to be revealed among us. I think the end of that mystery will be a simpler church that understands what is truly important and lives it more deeply, a church that reflects the love of the one who so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believeth in him shall not die, but have everlasting life. And that's all I'm going to say. I have some points to ponder, and they are: can you detect the mission of God, the Missio Dei, at work in the turmoil around us? Does what is happening change your understanding of the mission of the church? And how can you encourage your church community to open itself more to the Missio Dei, the mission of God, today? Thank you.
And thank you, Bishop Jeff. Good collecting together of the challenge of continuing to do what the church is, and in fact, in the world to do, to join God in building the kingdom of God. I'm going to invite Keith to come back, and he's going to lead us into some time on a reflection of integrating technology. Keith.
All right, thank you for the chance to once again to be part of this, and this is going to be a little less theoretical this time. So make yourself comfortable. I've had an odd career path, which might not surprise those of you who know me a little bit. Having spent 15 years as a parish priest, mostly in Alberta, then due to a set of circumstances that I won't bore you with at the moment, I ended up working in environmental policy in Alberta for 15 years before returning to parish ministry, this time in Newfoundland. I have spent what feels like several years of my life in meetings, both in church and non-church settings, in person and in various electronic formats. I don't claim any wisdom other than what I've learned through getting a lot of things wrong, but I wanted to start with a couple examples that I found helpful in figuring out how we use this stuff well and where it doesn't work well. And I want to start with talking about a physician in one parish I was in. He was a man who was approaching retirement age and was the old traditional general practitioner, rural family practice. And they were increasingly moving towards telemedicine, which was basically a TV camera at each end and a way to provide medical care for those in some of the more remote communities. But one of the things he talked about was it had helped him realize how much of the information he used in assessing patients is simply not available over the TV link. He talked about the fact that when someone comes in to see him, particularly a patient he's known for years, he was aware that that whole time he's looking for, do they smell differently? Is their breathing labored? Do they talk differently? When they sit down in the chair, is there that little pause, that little grunt? How do they walk? How do they stand? And all of that information that you don't get over the television or online, I guess now it would be. For simple things, he said, the television hookup works. And most of the things that bring people to doctors' offices are simple, but the ones that aren't matter a lot. And they can best be caught through those subtle but real indicators that simply didn't show up with the new technology. Another example, in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was on a national church committee. The members of the committee were good, faithful people, and generally speaking, they were very likable. Due to budget constraints, a decision was made to hold a telephone meeting rather than meet in person. Now, it happened that there was a contentious issue that needed to be discussed, and frankly, it went badly sideways. I was the one chairing the meeting, or trying to, but somewhere in the middle, it headed for the ditch. By the time the smoke cleared, one person had quit the committee, and another person threatened another member with a lawsuit. I wish I could say I was making that up, but I'm not. What I found was as the emotions went up, the lack of subtlety and the ability to react in helpful ways that can be there in person were sorely missed. Two more examples. When I worked for the province of Alberta on the climate change policy file, we started a Canada-wide provincial climate policy staff call on Friday mornings. At the time, the Harper government was doing a lot of talking, but a lot of going around in circles on sectoral targets and performance standards and details that I won't bore you with. But in order to make sense out of what was happening, those of us working at the provincial level from across the country set up a call every Friday morning to see what was going on, and so that we have better clarity and present a united front as much as we could. Now, to tell you the truth, I think some of the people at the federal level were a little bit rattled when they found out we were meeting without them. But the meetings were very good. They were very focused, they were very efficient, and that was in part because the focus was on information that had minimal emotional content. Last one. I love preaching, in part because despite appearances to the contrary, it's anything but a one-way process. The constant real-time feedback that comes from watching people's reactions to what is being said, to seeing the energy level ebb and flow, to noticing how often people look at their watches, and that intoxicating feeling when you know you have them. That doesn't happen when you've got 2 or 3 people in the building. Over the last 13 or so weeks, we've been recording our services for online viewing. We have a little congregation made of painted rocks with googly eyes that helps a little bit, but preaching to a mostly empty church is not nearly as satisfying. The screwdriver is great for putting in screws, but it does a really lousy job with nails and hammers with screws and vice versa. The technology that many of us are learning how to use can be a powerful tool to communicate with our people. It's inexpensive relatively. It's available to many, but to be honest, not all the people we're trying to reach. It does some jobs very well, but not all. What are the challenges for us in this current situation? I think one of the things that's brought many of us to spend these 3 mornings together is that we're trying to figure out what the task is that we're looking to do with these new tools and how we can do it well. It might be any of the following or a combination of them. In some cases, we're trying to keep enough money coming in to keep the parish alive until things return to normal. In some cases, we do it because it's what everybody's doing and we can't think of anything else. In some cases, we're providing the consolation of the familiar to regular attenders who are missing their friends and fellow congregates in what for many of them is a frightening and a lonely time. Some of us may think we're finally getting our chance at stardom when we look at the number of people at the little bottom of the screen. Some of us are really trying to reach out to a new group of people who may not have been interested in our parish, who may live in other communities. Some of us are really trying hard to think of new ways of being church in a rapidly changing world. And some of us, hopefully lots of us, are seeking to preach the good news in any way to anyone who's willing to hear it. But whether we're successful, or perhaps more to the point, whether we think we're successful in our online outreach, will depend in large part on what we think we're doing. This is a weird and a busy time, and the time and reflection that it takes to work out what we're doing and the ecclesiology and theology that inform our use of these new tools, that's hard to come by, but it's really important if we're going to be faithful and effective. When I speak with people who are in the midst of very difficult times, as many of us do, one of the things I sometimes say to them is that there are days when making it to the end of the day still breathing counts as a win. There are parishes, as the bishop said a few minutes ago, whose existence has been placed at significant risk. As much as we can talk theoretically about death and rebirth and how the church is called to abandon its building and structures, it's very tough to be ministering in a place where they may not be able to pay the bills, including our salaries. So it's okay to be frightened and unsure, but we're called to lead in difficult times, whether we chose it or not. And we have an opportunity to do something important that will impact the people who follow us for a long time. I have to confess, I was tempted to say something along the lines of, so just put on your big boy or big girl cassock and deal with it, but I didn't. So that's probably was a wise decision. But I want to recognize that for some of us, this is the hardest piece of ministry we've ever done. And for some of us, it's a surprisingly enjoyable time. But for all of us, there's a chance to learn and be open to all kinds of ministry that we never thought we'd be doing, not the least of which is to think about what exactly that is. So as we look to integrating this new technology and these new opportunities that we may or may not have chosen and we may or may not be enthusiastic about, I think it's an opportunity to look at what we do and how we do it. So, some points to ponder. What are we aiming to accomplish in our electronic communications? Given that goal, is it in fact an effective tool? And if it was, how would we know? How might we compensate or adjust to do a better job? Are there other tools that can be used in addition to or instead of the electronic means? And how might we need to adjust our goal and our view of what we think church ought to be in our current situation? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Keith. Very good focus again to the need to try and bring our minds and our hearts to what we do, why we do it, how we do it, what the purpose of it is. And good lead into next section is going to be Reverend Rob Cook. Rob, of course, as most of you know, is pastor at St. Mark's and St. John's. And Rob is going to bring us into a bit of a glimpse, as he calls it, toward a theology of technology. It's an interesting and important that we kind of start to understand and appreciate what does it tell us about God? What does God tell us about God in the way we use our technology? So Rob, I'll pass it to you. I'll ask you to turn on your camera if you will.
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of this stuff. Don't be fooled by the title of my talk. It's not as profound, not nearly as profound as the title makes it out to be. These are just some of my own kind of ruminations as we've been thrown more into this digital world in the last 10 to 12 weeks. I'm probably going to be a little bit shorter and go through some of this more quickly than I had planned, because I'm just looking at the time, and I would like to offer a fair bit of time for questions and conversation, because I think that's really important when we're talking about something like digital technology and ministry and those kinds of things. So my presentation is a little bit different, and I'm going to be focusing on, first of all, what is technology and what is digital technology, and then, as Rick just alluded to, how digital technology in particular is impacting our theology, and maybe even vice versa. So just some of the interplay between those two, and then offering some reflection questions at the end. So first of all, what even is technology? We've thrown that word around a fair bit here today and in the last several weeks, but what do we mean by technology? And so I guess the basic definition of technology is those two words that make up technology. The last part, very familiar to us, logia, study or reading. And then the first part comes from another Greek word, techne. And in the original Greek, it means art, skill, or cunning of hand. And so technology in a really broad sense is the skills, knowledge, methods, and processes that go into manufacturing goods or achieving objectives. But technology can be both intellectual, like in our minds, but technology also has a practical outcome. So our You know, we know the theory and everything, and then that makes something like a smartphone or a microphone or a car. So what do we mean by digital technology then? So digital technology really is just technology that enables quicker and easier communication. And digital technology really came into the fore and kicked off what we refer to now as the digital age or the information age back in the late 70s. So it's all still fairly new to us in terms of human evolution. But the early innovations around digital technology would have been things like the computer chip, the personal computer, the internet, email, satellite technology. This was kind of like the first stage of digital technology. And then in something we refer to as Web 2.0, that's when I think our digital technology really mushroomed in terms of the impact on our communications. And that's when things like web publishing tools, so the ease, you could now publish on the internet without having to know how to write code. You could, there was all kinds of apps and things that people could use to easily publish things. The smartphone, which we're still unpacking the impact of that on us and on our society. Things like file sharing for music, but also for documents and those kinds of things. And then, of course, social media, which is still a relatively new phenomenon, but increasingly more and more people are using things like digital technology and social media. But in a way, technology goes way beyond that. There's more to technology, and especially digital technology, than just the basic, the accomplishment of goals or objectives. And I think to a certain extent, at least from the conversations that I've heard, a lot of our conversations about technology have kind of stalled there, right? Around how do we use technology? What can we do with technology? And so what I want us to start thinking about is a little bit deeper about technology and the impacts of technology, and in particular digital technology, on us as human beings, and on how we view each other, and also on how we view God. One of the big things about any kind of technology, and I think even more so with digital technology, is the promise that it claims to offer, which is really about augmentation and amplification of our bodies. So it's really about breaking the bonds and limitations of humanity, and in particular our bodies. So think about, a technology like the telephone, right? So the telephone amplifies our voice. It helps us to throw our voice further. Television does that visually with our eyes, right? We were able to see things further at a distance. And when you think about digital technology, digital technology really amplifies and augments the way that we are present to each other, right? And I think this is a really important conversation for us in the church, and some of our earlier conversations around presence. In a way, digital technology enables us to extend our understanding of being present with others. Because unlike other technologies that came before it, digital technology does hold the promise of a two-way communication, right? That the communication goes both ways. It's not like watching TV where you're just a passive consumer of television, but that the internet and social media and other digital technologies offer the way of two-way presence. But technology goes even further than that too, because technology also is a kind of window into the soul. Now, some of the writers who are a bit more skeptical of technology and the impact of technology on us worry that technology probably brings out the worst in us, and what is already present in our heart. Technology, again, is an amplification of the heart and of the soul as well. So a name that's probably familiar to some, a very influential philosopher from around the middle of the 20th century, a German philosopher, Martin Heidegger, who was very skeptical of technology. He says about technology, to a man with a hammer, everything is a nail, right? And so what he means by that is the technology changes the way that we see the world. The technology that we use changes the way we see the world around us, the way we see each other, the way we see ourselves, and I would even say the way we see God. But when you think about that, so think about what I just said about all those things I just said about technology, we could just as easily say the same things about theology, right? That the gap between theology and technology is not as great as we might make it out to be. I would even go so far as to say theology is technological and technology is theological, right? They both go kind of hand in hand. In some ways, you could say that theology is a kind of technology, and that definitely technology is theological. So we form our technologies, and then they form us, right? That's what Martin Heidegger was trying to get at, that these technologies change us and form us. You could say the same thing about theology, right? That we form our theologies, but then our theologies form us. So the difference between theology and technology are not as great as we might initially think. Slide 2, please. So just a very brief history of technology and theology, and I'm only going to do a couple of points here on how our technology changes and impacts our theology. And so I guess the very basic technology that really changed, and you might even say opened up a possibility for things like philosophy and theology, is the advent of the use of fire as a technology for human beings. Kester Bruin, who is a British mathematician, but also theologian, he makes the case that really it is fire that enables us, frees up the space and time for us to become theologians and philosophers, because he says our primate ancestors spent something like 2/3 of their time chewing because they were eating raw food. And so with the advent of fire, it freed up all of this time. Now we didn't have to spend so much time chewing. So he said it's freed up time. And he said you might even make the argument that this time freed up gave way to things like the use of more tools, the development of language, and also what we call today religion, theology, and philosophy. So that technology was so powerful on how we view the world around us. One other one, the printing press is another great example of how that changed how we communicate with each other. But I would say too, also how the way that we think about God, right? God became a more a textual idea rather than a present reality. So technology is very informative, very formative of our theology, which begs the question, what is digital technology doing to the way that we view God and the way that we view each other? I think it's no accident that in the last 25 years or so, we've seen a recovery, a deeper appreciation of the mystics, because the mystics had this more kind of hyper, they viewed God as more of a hyper being rather than just a being. And so there's no, I think there's no mistake or no fluke that we're now recovering some of that language about God as well, and the mystics are becoming very important to us again. Next slide, please. So what is a theology of technology or techno-theology? Now, Anglicans in general have been very slow to adopt, newer technologies. And if we trace back maybe to even the advent of the television, Anglicans have been very slow to embrace some of these newer technologies. And one of the reasons why I think is because of our incarnational theology, right? We are very big on the material presence, right? which is seen in our Sacramental theology. And so we're very big on physicality and physical presence. And so some of these newer technologies that don't seem to leave room for any kind of physical presence, I think we've been a little bit skeptical of them and slow to embrace them, which is why I think we're kind of in a bind now in the last 10 to 12 weeks and trying to, get on track with getting our heads around some of these technologies. But I would caution us that, digital technology doesn't mean disembodied. It doesn't mean that there's not a presence. It's just that the presence is different. Remember what we were saying about amplification? And so there's still a physicality. Now we're talking about data and code and wires and servers and even like people developing all this stuff too. So it's still a very physical and material technology that just amplifies and changes the way we're present to each other. But the problem with modern technologies, digital technologies, is that first of all, they are developing so quickly. And the other one is that they are just so powerful. Probably some of the most powerful technologies that we have developed as human beings. So much so that our technological development is outpassing our theological reflection. And this is where I think the church could have an increasingly important role in developing this, kind of this new theology. And so there are thinkers like Yuval Harari and Barry Taylor who, ask us to kind of straddle two ways of, not to fall into two traps with technology, to reject it outright, to become like Luddites and technophobes, but neither to embrace it blindly, but to engage in a critical usage, a critical experience of technology. And so I think it's really important for us to be thinking about the theological implications of technology. Things like, what does it mean to be human? Who owns technology? And because technology is so data driven and driven by our data, who owns that data? And in a sense, where data is so valuable in our world, well then who owns us even, right? If we are just our data. And we always have to be asking, can we trust the promises of technology? Then there's issues around justice issues, around accessibility. And then also, as hard as it is right now to be looking towards the future and some other technological advancements, like around artificial intelligence, the increasing power of algorithms, and also, and this sounds really science fiction-y, but it's not that far away, the idea of human upgrades, right? And who gets those? Who gets the technology that makes us live longer and be more healthy? Is it just the wealthy that are going to get those? So that's real quick the things that I had. If we could put up that last slide, which are so not my questions to ponder, but questions to Google. What are digital technologies doing to us? And what do digital technologies reveal about God and about us? Over to you, Rick.
Great, thanks, Rob. Very interesting, and thanks for the thoughts you've put into this matter and shared with us. What I want us to do now is engage in what we describe as a windjammer in facilitators lingo. It's the phase in a session where we try to bring it together and get where we're going with the initiative to explore and what have you. Windjammer refers to a ship that's well rigged with lots of canvas on it to grab every breath, every draft, without taking the wind out of the other sails. I hear the old cliche, taking the wind out of the sails was a strategy in sailing navies. So our windjammer is really to try and capture the thoughts and ideas that have been brought to it, and to now bring it together to kind of gain momentum or insight into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask the panelists if you'd all turn on your cameras and just take a moment to see if anyone wants to comment or further add to what they've presented, so that we can share amongst yourselves with us any further insights or qualifications you'd want to put to your presentation. Then we're going to throw it open to other participants, attendees, for questions, comments, insights. I also want to forecast that a couple of other things we'll do before we wrap up today. One is I want to tell you about an initiative that we're launching at Queen's in response to an invitation from the Anglican Church of Canada to prepare a document on the Eucharist in this time of pandemic. And the other matter that I want to draw to your attention is I'd like feedback on or suggestions from you by email would be fine, of matters you would like us to approach in next week's session, and also in the session on personal and professional wellness. But for now, I just want to open it to the panelists to turn on your cameras and if you would, share your thoughts and ideas with us.
I'll kick off with really just, I don't suppose this has an answer, but one of the things that we heard various versions of is, to what extent do we see the current situation with the pandemic and with as something that God is leading us to, or something that is just, it just happened? You know, there's an expression that comes to mind. I think the Anglican translation is excrement occurs. But there's a more less subtle version that often we use. I struggle in general with, you know, the extent to which we ascribe intentionality to nature in ways that I don't know the Bible does. I mean, it's not that clear always, you know, but, you know, as to what extent did the Spirit somehow map this out and provide us with a great opportunity, which would be one way, you know, that I've heard some, not necessarily today, but I've heard some use this. And to what extent is this is just an awful thing that happened? And God is with us, and God will use our gifts and our abilities to bring us through it if we're faithful. And that, to me, is one of the basic theological questions for a lot of folks, though, and certainly for myself. You know, did this just land on us, and it has no particular meaning other than it's another opportunity to find how to do ministry, or is there some deeper meaning underneath it? Now, I'll just leave it there.
Great, thank you, Keith. Any further comment or observation from panelists?
I'd like to make a comment. This winter, I read a book. I'll try to get it in here now so you can see it, called Homes. And it's the story of a young man, Abu Bakr al-Rahabiyah, that was written by his teacher of his experience of moving from Iraq to Syria to Canada. And the whole notion of what constitutes home. He was a young boy who grew up in war-torn Iraq, so he really never had a sense of non-war. He was driven from, or his family half driven, and then fled to Syria. And I'm getting an echo here. I don't know why.
I expect somebody has on their.
Okay, we try again.
Okay, go
There
ahead.
we go. Okay, so the family fled from Iraq to Syria, and they were not long in Syria, and Syria erupts in war as well. The family immediately starts to look to get out of Syria. First, they thought go back to Iraq is not as bad, and then the father says, no, we're going to move to Canada. Well and good. So long story. But here's the piece. They learned something about being family in Iraq in the midst of wartime. They learned how to become part of a community of which they had no connection whatsoever when they moved to Syria, and among the refugees who were there, and the business that they tried to build up, and then that fell apart. They looked forward to something in Canada. In betwixt and between all of it, that notion of home, where do we find who we are, how we gather, where we take our strength, and where we reach out from. at the last part of it was they finally got this really quick call, and they had to be ready within 48 hours to go to Canada. And when they went, they could take 2 suitcases each, nothing else. And it made me wonder at that time, this was pre-COVID, like, what is it in our church that has been so battered and torn and changed? As we move forward, if we're going to move to the theological equivalent of Canada, which was a goal for these people, where they could thrive, where they thought there was opportunity, what from our past, from our experience of being community, both in upsetting times and in stable times, what would be in our 2 suitcases? What would we determine we really need to leave behind? So I thought it was a powerful, powerful story and image. Like, are we refugees? Another word, the biblical word, is pilgrim. Pilgrims don't carry a whole lot of stuff with them. Pilgrims are on the move. That's it.
Thanks, Carmel. Any other panelists with an insight or afterthought? Okay, I'm just going to ask now that anyone who's attending, if you would have a question or a comment or insight that you'd want to share. A few mics that I turned off, I will unmute them. So I ask people, if your mic comes on, to pay attention to it yourself. But questions or comments, please. Questions or comments, please. I'll ask people to turn on.
Hi,
I'll ask people to turn on.
this is Liz. Can you hear me?
Yes, Liz. Yes, Liz.
Oh, we can hear me today. Good. I have 2 comments on Rob's excellent speech. I see he's grinning because he knows I was going to say something. One is very good. One of the things about the technology, particularly the interactive technology, is that people who have a learning disability often get it when it's on a technology. People like that, especially younger people who aren't comfortable in speaking and certainly not comfortable in reading in front of people, the interaction of the technology helps. And I have a son like that, and I discovered that this is really, really good for him. The other thing I want to say, technology, however, if we're on screen or on phone or whatever, if we look back at the Jungian concept of mask, it is much easier to create a mask for ourselves with Rob's nodding, I see, with the technology. So sometimes, and I'm not saying it happens to everybody all the time, but sometimes it's easier to put on the mask and use the mask rather than what we really feel and see in our souls, in our hearts. So just 2 comments. Thanks, Rob. I really enjoyed that. You knew I would. I'm done.
Thank you, Liz. Great.
Thanks for letting me talk.
Thank you, Liz. Great.
It was good.
Norman Cutler would like to make a comment.
Norman Cutler would like to make a comment. Okay, go ahead, Norman.
Go ahead, Norman. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I just want to say that I've been a presenter of services by Facebook, and I do want to say that for each service that we have done, I have prepared as I would for a Sunday service in any of our communities. I have showered, shaved, put on my best clothing because I really thought I was going to church to do this. I was concerned about competition as we began our services by the internet, and I had expressed that to members of our deanery, but it's not competition. It is dignity, respect for wanting to continue with good news and via the internet. And I appreciated the comments that came back, and I really would like to say thank you to those that have responded. I think there are people that have said the church has reached out to me, and I appreciate that too. And for many of us, I just want to say that I do want to think I present our services with respect, and that I am concerned that it is an important way to speak to people and to have people speak to me for the gospel. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Butler. Other questions or comments, folks? Just one comment came in on the chat room, or an inquiry. I will read it. It's from Michael Crothers. He says, is there a difference in kind between images generated by excited electrons and images graved in stone, or is it merely a difference of degree? Any comment to that, or? I don't know, Michael, if you want to add anything to it, and I'm not sure why we're getting. Okay.
Rick,
Yes,
just
Colonel.
with the comment just before then, that whole notion that there are people who are reaching out to us, or as in Paulette's story, the sense of people are coming back to church. A couple of comments, not unlinked, but very, very brief. First one is that today's world suffers greatly from anxiety, particularly those under the age of 40. Anxiety is a real plague of a size much larger than COVID-19, which is largely unseen. For many of those people who are extremely anxious, technology gives them the freedom to stay where they are and not have to go into strange places where they may or may not know the customs, be looked at, questioned, which they're not ready for. Now, the situation of anxiety needs to be addressed, but technology certainly presents that possibility for those people. The other thing is that really hit me just then, as our speaker before the last one was talking about, was those who said, thank you for doing this. Do you know what is actually happening there? I was just thinking about it. For the first time in a long time, I think, many people are experiencing the presence of the church, the presence of the whoever the rector, minister, whoever you may be, in their own homes. They're not coming to us. We are going to them. We are in their homes, and being in their homes speaks to them in a way that perhaps some of the church piece doesn't. We're going to them. So how do we maintain that going to their homes? We lost visitation a long time ago, particularly as we had to put multiple points in parishes. And then all of the many duties that so many people have to, or think they have to, maintain in order to follow all the directives and expectations of people. But that personal piece of being in their homes, I think, is a significant bit. That's it, real quiet now.
Great, thank you, Carmel. Folks, we're going to move it towards wrap up now. I just want to draw your attention to two things, and then we're going to come back to the closing reflection. I mentioned earlier that we are launching a consultation on Eucharist, and this is in response to an initiative of the Anglican Church of Canada for requests from theological schools and others across Canada as well for submissions on Eucharistic practices and sacramental theology in a time of pandemic. So Dr. Bell, our Dean, and John Courage, our chaplain, are going to do the work on it. I will organize and facilitate some of the the sessions, but we'll probably have about 3 sessions or so. We'll be sending them out. So here's what we've been asked to do. It's on the screen there. You can take a look at it yourselves. And if you're interested in attending the consultation sessions, you can send me an email, and then I'll send the specific times and details of when and where we'll have the, or at least when we'll have the webinar consultation sessions. But basically, what we've been asked to do from the Faith Worship Ministry Committee is to contribute to discussions and development of resources on the Eucharist. The committee has invited input on core theological, ethical, ecclesiological, and pastoral questions that have arisen from the experience of COVID and subsequent experiences. Their work will be shared with the Council of General Synod in the fall, with the aim to share guidelines, theological reflections, and a potential study guide more broadly as well. And so, as I mentioned, David and John will do the collection and reflection and development of a paper from us, which will be shared with those who participate. So that's one item. The other is that our next 2 sessions, one is next week, with the primer on pastoral and technological tools and skills. If you have any particular items that you want to ask about or make sure that are dealt with in that session, please send me a note. We have our planning session for that one tomorrow morning. The session the same time next Wednesday, and then the last sessions on personal and professional wellness. There again, I ask if you have any particular thoughts or ideas. Carmel just mentioned anxiety. Again, send it along to make sure that we include it by bring it to the presenter, Kurt Hillier, the resource person, who will present for about 45 minutes, and the panelists who will be engaging in other discussion in the session. So those are the things we have on tap. I want to bring it back and hand it back to Carmel to lead us through a wrap-up reflection time. Holy listening.
Okay, we thought we'd finish with, we thought we'd finish with Lectio Divina, or holy listening, on call, and the call being, at this time, the call of Abram, who was called to go a very long way to something he wasn't even sure where the final destination was, or how he was to proceed. The one thing we know is that distance was significant. He had to leave behind all those structures, connections, PowerPoints, affirmation structures that were there for him, and he had to travel. He could take with him his goods, his animals, his family, but he had to leave everything else behind. So if we go to the first moment, or the first part of holy listening, which will be the next slide, what we'll do is I'll read the passage, and I ask you to notice what word or phrase, image, feeling, question jumps out at you as you think about Abram and you think about our time. And then we're not going to share without necessarily, we won't share a whole lot, but we'll leave a few moments if anyone wants to say a word, a phrase, an image, a feeling, a question, no more than that, without any discussion with the group. And before we move on to the reading, I just want to put there for you on this top slide, if you notice, I went in and found out the distances between and Haran, 950 kilometers. And then from Haran down to Canaan, 12,180 kilometers. And look down at the bottom picture, how they traveled. That's one long, long way. Over time, his father made the first move to bring them to Haran, and then Abram moved from Haran eventually to Canaan, beyond into Egypt even further. Okay, so we'll move on to the first reading. So I want you to, for those who, next slide please, for those who are really used to reading, I'm going to ask you, if at all possible, to resist the temptation to read along and just hear the words. Hear the words to see what jumps at you as you hear this. And this is a reading from the New International Version. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent. And with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev. Now, what word, phrase, image, feeling, question jumps out at you in some way? So if we can have a few representative reflection. Just the word, nothing more, nothing more.
So Abraham went.
Blessed.
You will be a blessing.
Set out and continued.
I will show you.
Will be blessed through you.
Blessed to be a blessing.
The people they had acquired in Haran.
Go from your country.
Built an altar and worshipped.
Okay, let's move on to the second piece of this. Next slide. So I'm going to reread the passage from another version. And now this time as we hear the word, ask the question, how does this passage relate to some issue, relationship, or situation that you're experiencing in your life right now? No, Rick, move ahead to the next slide and the next one again. Okay, because it's a different version. So again, what issue, relationship, situation right now against the backdrop of what we're experiencing in your own life or as a community? So this reading is from the New Reserved Standard Version. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran. And they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. And when they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So how does this passage relate to some issue, relationship, or situation in your, or should it be our, life? And just very brief sentence, you're allowed 2 at the most.
In these very strange days, even old institutions filled with old people can be obedient and go into strange and unknown territories in faith.
I looked at "to the land I will show you," and I think the key there is "I will show you," as speaking for God will show us. And so I think about listening and paying attention to God in this time and in the time to come, as we try to return to what we thought we knew, but what will the new normal be?
God shows no partiality, and God is the guide of us all. There is no partiality and treats everyone equally.
For Abraham, it was a time of great change, and we are apparently now living in a time of great change.
When we go the distance, that God goes with us.
And now we'll move to moment 3. It's going to be reread, this another version. And now we're asking ourselves the question, if I think maybe more significantly, we were to really believe what this passage says, as we move forward, what would we do differently and what would change for us? Okay, and the last version is from the Message. God told Abram, "Leave your country, your family, your father's home for a land I will show you. I'll make you a great nation, and bless you. I'll make you famous. You'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I'll curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So Abram left just as God said, and Lot left with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot with him, along with all the possessions and people they had gotten in Haran, and set out for the land of Canaan, and arrived safe and sound. Abram passed through the country as far as Shechem and the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites occupied the land. God appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your children. Abram built an altar at the place God had appeared to him. If we were to really believe what this passage says, what would we do differently, and what would change for us? As I look at that picture, I think the things that are most significant that we need to take with us as we move forward are the relationships, the people, as was said in here, and only those possessions which can be mobile and can be brought through a strange, a foreign, and possibly a very threatening landscape.
Not quite the answer, but what I wanted to say was, just one moment, is that God is protecting us as we make decisions for Him to move forward. What I heard about if we are honored by people, we will be honored. If we are cursed by people, God will protect us. I heard that very strongly, that we make decisions to move forward. He is there to protect us, to honor how we move forward.
And regardless of what that moving forward will look like, which we are unsure of at this point, we know that God will be with us.
God is with us on whatever way we choose to journey on in this time. A need to lament, repent of our fearfulness, to recommit our trust. I heard trust is there. And we will be a blessing. That was clear what I heard. We are to be the blessings, and wonderful things will come from that. Yeah.
Okay, now we shall take a moment just for some quiet reflection, prayer. And you might want to just repeat the word or phrase that caught your attention or somebody else's attention. And together we ask God to help us make necessary changes and to thank God for the inspiration that we've received from hearing His word and hearing others reflect upon it. Just take a moment or so for that.
Folks, I want to take a moment to thank those who have participated today, those who participated in the panel, Bishop Jeff, Carmel, Keith, Paulette, and Rob. Thank you for the time you put into the planning and the preparation, the presentation today. Thank you to those who attended and shared comments, thoughts, and ideas. And some shared thoughts and ideas on the chat room as well, and I hadn't read them, but I acknowledge that they're there. They were shared openly, so others responded, and there was some dialogue amongst people. Thanks for that. I remind you to send me a note if you'd like to participate in our consultation on the Eucharist, and also send me a note if you have thoughts, ideas, or matters you'd like to have included in session 2 next week on primer, on pastoral and technical tools and skills, or on the session on personal and professional wellness. Thanks for attending. Blessings to you all. God bless.
Thank you.